BJ Penn was once one of the most gifted fighters to ever enter the sport. He was the first American to win a world championship in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a two-division UFC champion, and a man whose natural talent seemed limitless. But over time, that same relentless drive to keep pushing forward and proving himself became the force that pulled his life apart. Today, Penn's name is often mentioned not for what he achieved, but for how far he's fallen. BJ Penn grew up in Hilo, Hawaii. He was athletic and competitive from a young age, but he didn't find direction until he discovered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the age of 17. Penn's progress was unlike anything the sport had ever seen. While most practitioners take a decade or more to reach black belt level, Penn earned his in just 3 years. By 2000, he had made history, becoming the first non-Brazilian to win the World Jiu-Jitsu Championship at the black belt level. That win changed everything. Penn wasn't just another fighter training overseas. He was the proof that Americans could master Brazil's most sacred art. Coaches and promoters began calling him the Prodigy. It wasn't a nickname designed for hype, it was a statement of fact. He entered the UFC in 2001 with no prior professional fights, something almost unheard of at the time. But from his first appearance, it was clear this wasn't a typical rookie. Penn brought the precision of a world-class grappler and combined it with sharp, instinctive striking that overwhelmed his early opponents. In the space of a few months, he knocked out Joey Gilbert, Din Thomas, and Kaol Uno, fighters who were already established contenders in the lightweight division. His speed, balance, and composure stood out in an era when most fighters were still one-dimensional. He wasn't just winning, he was dismantling opponents who were supposed to test him. The UFC moved quickly to capitalize on the momentum. By his fourth professional bout, Penn was already fighting for the lightweight title. Commentators and fans began referring to him as the sport's next major star. He carried himself with a calm, almost detached confidence that contrasted with the aggression he showed in the cage. His first title shot came against Jens Pulver, a skilled, well-rounded fighter who had been through the grind of the division. The match was competitive, but Penn's inexperience showed. Pulver outworked him over 5 rounds and handed him his first professional loss. In Penn's view, the decision reflected more than just what happened in the cage. He believed he'd done enough to win and that the judges had sided with the established champion because of his standing with the company. That feeling of being undermined by politics rather than performance stuck with him. In the months after the fight, Penn made his frustration known. He spoke openly about what he saw as bias within the company, that judging, matchmaking, and pay all favored established names over newcomers. The loss had convinced him that skill alone wasn't enough to succeed in the UFC. That was a belief that would shape the way he approached the rest of his career. After losing that first title shot at lightweight, he made a move that didn't make sense on paper. He jumped up to welterweight to fight Matt Hughes, a dominant champion who hadn't lost in years. Hughes was stronger, bigger, and known for grinding opponents into the mat. Penn was supposed to be another name added to the streak. Instead, he dismantled him. At UFC 46 in January 2004, Penn controlled the fight from the start, outclassed Hughes on the ground, and submitted him with a rear naked choke in the first round. The upset stunned everyone. Hughes had been the face of the division, the unstoppable American wrestler. Penn had walked in as an undersized challenger and made it look effortless. That win crowned him the UFC welterweight champion and proved what many already suspected. BJ Penn wasn't bound by weight classes or logic, he was simply that good. Then, just as fast as he won the belt, he was gone. A month before the Hughes fight, Penn's contract had quietly expired. When Japan's K1 organization offered him around $150,000 per fight, nearly 10 times what he was earning in the UFC, he took it. To Penn, it was simple. He had earned his freedom, and he was going to get paid what he was worth. Dana White saw it as betrayal. He stripped Penn of the title, called him disloyal, and moved to block him from fighting elsewhere. The UFC even tried to take legal action, arguing Penn was still bound by a champion's clause. But K1 ran shows in Japan and Hawaii, well outside the UFC's reach, and Penn fought on anyway. It was a defining moment in his story. At the peak of his career, BJ Penn walked away from the biggest promotion in the world because he refused to be told what he was worth. But as his success outside the company grew, so did the UFC itself. By 2006, the promotion had exploded in popularity under the Fertitta brothers and Dana White, with new television deals and pay structures that made it a different organization from the one Penn had left. Both sides saw the value in a reunion. The grudge had cooled, the sport had changed, and the business was booming. Penn and Dana White eventually met and agreed to start again. But his comeback wasn't smooth. He lost close fights to Georges St-Pierre and Matt Hughes while moving between weight classes, trying to find his place again. But when he settled back at lightweight, everything clicked. He avenged his first loss by submitting Jens Pulver, then captured the vacant lightweight title at UFC 80 by choking out Joe Stevenson. His striking looked sharper than ever, and his takedown defense was near perfect. He crushed former champion Sean Shirk, submitted Kenny Florian, and stopped Diego Sanchez in a brutal doctor's stoppage that ended with Sanchez's face torn open. That run cemented Penn as one of the greatest lightweights in history. Joe Rogan called him the best we've ever seen. At UFC 94 in 2009, he moved back to welterweight for a rematch with Georges St-Pierre. This was Penn's attempt to become a champion in two different weight divisions and to avenge his first loss. Their first fight had been close. This one wasn't. GSP dominated every round, taking Penn down at will and breaking him apart until his corner stopped the fight after the fourth round. But what came after did more damage than the loss itself, as Penn accused GSP of cheating, claiming his cornerman had spread Vaseline on his shoulders to make him too slippery to grapple. The Nevada Commission investigated, confirmed some Vaseline had been applied by mistake, and issued warnings. No intentional wrongdoing was found, but Penn refused to accept it. His camp filed formal complaints and threatened lawsuits, arguing the fight should be overturned. Nothing came of it, but the controversy became known as Greasegate. For the first time, the public started to see cracks in Penn's untouchable persona. The fighter who once won with calm precision now seemed consumed by paranoia and excuses. The aura of the Prodigy began to fade. Penn's decline began where his dominance had once been absolute, the lightweight division. In 2010, he defended his title against Frankie Edgar, a challenger few expected to win. The fight went the distance, and when the judges gave Edgar the decision, many were stunned. But the rematch removed any doubt. Edgar outworked Penn from bell to bell, using speed and movement to make the champion look slow and one-dimensional. For Penn, it was a turning point. He'd spent his entire career believing his natural ability could overcome anything. Against Edgar, that illusion ended. He briefly rallied with a first-round knockout of Matt Hughes later that year, closing out their trilogy in decisive fashion. But that win turned out to be the last of his career. From that moment on, BJ Penn never won another fight. Most fighters reach a point where they can no longer do what they used to. Penn reached that point, refused to believe it, and kept coming back anyway. He announced his retirement more than once, only to return a few months later. Each time, the results were the same: one-sided defeats and visible frustration. He fought at welterweight against Nick Diaz and Rory MacDonald, both bigger, younger, and more active fighters. The MacDonald fight was particularly brutal. Penn absorbed hundreds of strikes and had no answer. It wasn't competitive, it was punishment. Still, he couldn't walk away. He talked about making history by becoming the first man to win UFC titles in 3 divisions. The dream kept him chasing, but the damage piled up. By 2017, the comeback attempts had turned desperate. He was stopped by Yair Rodriguez, then lost to Dennis Seaver, Ryan Hall, and Clay Guida, setting the record for the longest losing streak in UFC history. The numbers were bad, but the optics were worse. Every return looked less like ambition and more like denial. In August 2019, Penn's downfall finally spilled into public view. Footage emerged from his hometown of Hilo, Hawaii, showing him involved in two separate street fights. In the first, he was on top of another man, throwing punches. In the second, he was standing against a wall, telling someone to hit him, and when they did, he was knocked unconscious on the sidewalk. The videos spread quickly. Witnesses said Penn had been drinking and was acting erratically. For many fans, it was the moment the decline became impossible to ignore. The fighter, once known for his iron chin and composure, was now being knocked out in the street. Dana White made the decision public. He said Penn would never fight in the UFC again, ending the career of one of the sport's original icons. But even after the fighting stopped, the damage kept showing. Penn had spent nearly 2 decades defining himself through combat. Without that outlet, his life drifted further off course. His life away from the octagon became a blur of arrests, public altercations, and erratic behavior. In the years that followed the 2019 street fight footage, he was twice arrested for driving under the influence and found unconscious behind the wheel after crashing his car. Witnesses described him as volatile and unpredictable, a man drifting further from control with every incident. In 2018, his former partner filed a restraining order alleging years of abuse and threats. Penn denied the claims, calling them part of a custody dispute, but the story fit a pattern. The aggression that once made him a great fighter had now consumed every part of his life. By early 2025, his decline had turned into something darker. He began posting videos online, claiming that his mother and brothers had been murdered and replaced by imposters who were trying to steal his family's fortune. He spoke with conviction about the conspiracies, seemingly detached from reality. Psychiatrists have described such beliefs as consistent with Capgras syndrome, a rare psychiatric condition often linked to brain injury or neurodegenerative disease. In combat sports, those symptoms are widely associated with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, the result of years of head trauma. For fans, it was the most painful stage of all. The man who once carried himself with calm control was now lost in delusion, his mind breaking down in public. Even those who had long defended him were left stunned. This wasn't arrogance or ego anymore. It was a man no longer in touch with reality. The delusions reached their breaking point in May 2025. Police were called to Penn's home in Hilo, Hawaii, after an altercation with his 79-year-old mother. Reports stated that he had accused her of being an imposter, shined a flashlight in her eyes, and shoved her into a vehicle. The incident was filmed by Penn himself and posted to Instagram. He was arrested on a charge of abuse of a family or household member, offensive physical contact, then released on $2,000 bail. It was the logical endpoint of a long, visible decline. A fighter once celebrated for his discipline and pride, now confused, paranoid, and violent in his own home. The same man who had carried Hawaii's flag into the octagon as a world champion was now being booked in a Hawaii jail. BJ Penn's story had started as one of prodigious talent and national pride, but by 2025, it had become something else entirely. A portrait of what happens when a sport built on damage leaves its heroes behind.